Hello again, everybody. I'm delighted to be able to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Kevin Schurer. Professor Schurer worked at the University of Cambridge and then at the University of Essex, where he was the director of the UK Data Archive for a number of years. And since 2010, been at the University of Leicester as the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Enterprise. He's also held various national roles as well. He's been a member of the British Library Advisory Council, and he's also been heavily involved in the development of ETHOS, the British national UK electronic thesis service. So he's a very appropriate keynote speaker. We're delighted to have him here, and I'm sure, I haven't asked him this yet, but if there's a little bit of time at the end of his talk, I'm sure he'll also be very pleased to take some questions. So I'll hand you over to Professor Schurer. Thank you.
Thank you, one and all. Given the technical problems that we seem to have experienced thus far, you'll be glad to know that this is my PowerPoint presentation. So don't feel that you're missing anything by not being able to see the screens. Let me also start with an apology, and the apology is really as follows. A lot of what I'm going to say is very UK-centric. And that's not because I'm uninterested in international affairs. I clearly am. It's just that most of my experience within the higher education system is also UK-centric. So some of the things that I will be talking about will, although be focused on the UK, I hope will have wider implications as well. So, why am I here? Actually, I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure whether it's because I'm a PVC for Research and Enterprise at this particular university who are hosting this conference, and as the Vice-Chancellor has already said, we're very pleased and glad that the conference is here in Leicester. So I don't know whether it's that, or the fact that for the past 4 years I have been chair of the ETHOS, the UK Electronic Theses online service, and chairing that service on behalf primarily of the British Library. And in that time, over the last 4 years, as chair, I've taken it from a free at the point of use service to a relatively short-lived subscription service, and now back into a free at point use service again. And given that roller coaster ride, if you like, of providing a service for electronic theses, you might actually ask, well, why did I actually agree to chair ETHOS in the first place? Well, in part, I guess it's because I find it hard to actually say no to challenges. And that may indeed be another reason why I'm actually here in front of you today. But I think it's also, the main reason I accepted the request for me to chair ETHOS was because I'm a long-standing member of the Open Access Club, predating what in the UK we call the Finch Report, and ex-Cabinet Minister for Universities, he's recently been replaced as of last week, ex-Minister David Willetts, telling us that irrespective of what we thought about open access, we all had to join anyway, without really telling us what the membership fee of doing so was going to be. But over and above all, I think I'm really passionate about PhD theses being open research outputs. Why is that? I think there are two principal reasons. The first of these, and maybe here I'm just perhaps being old-fashioned and a bit of a stick in the mud, is that I firmly believe that all theses, with an emphasis on the all, should as a default be publicly available to everyone and anywhere, since this is a logical development of the public defence scrutiny through which an individual's theses traditionally would have had to demonstrate and take place. In this sense, I see a thesis essentially as a public document. Essentially, it's a kind of public record that has to have, it has to be able to hold its own within the public arena. And let's just clear up something whilst we're on the subject of the defence of theses. The terms dissertation and theses that we have in the title of this conference were, of course, traditionally not in any way interchangeable. They mean completely different things from one another. The position that one took whilst discussing a topic or theme during a disputation was your thesis, it's your position, while your dissertation is the line of logic or reasoning that you take to argue your position. They are two separate things. Anyway, history lecture over. You should not confuse the two. However, back to reason two, why I believe that theses should be open. And that is because I think theses are dramatically underused. Given not only the sheer hard work and effort that goes into delivering a thesis, writing a thesis, let alone the novelty, the imagination, and the synthesis of previous work, I'm constantly amazed and surprised that theses are not more widely read. The old adage that some supervisors tell their PhD students that a thesis will ever only be read by 4 people, the supervisor, if you're lucky, 2 examiners, and possibly your partner or your mother, is actually sadly true for far too many theses. So a lot of the knowledge, if you like, is subsequently lost. And yes, I am fully aware that subsequently, after your examination and defence of a thesis, I'm fully aware that subsequently some form the basis of monographs or are dissected and cut up and repackaged as chapters in books or articles. Realistically, this is actually the minority, not the majority. The majority of theses do not see the light of day in any published form. That's the reality. Yet thinking further about why I want theses to be openly accessible leads me to reflect on the current wider open access issue or issues. And admittedly, although this operates primarily, at least for the time being, on journal articles and some conference papers, I think it's useful to reflect on that discussion and that debate. And here I'm going to talk a little bit about the UK, but you can extend this to what's happening in your own countries. But following government policy in this country, the main funding councils, the Funding Council for England is referred to in this country as HEFSI. HEFSI state on their website that open access will deliver three things as follows. A, it will enable prompt and widespread dissemination of research findings. B, benefit the efficiency of research processes and economic growth driven by publicly funded research. And C, increase public understanding. Now, as an aside, if you actually go on, and you can test me out later this evening if you like, if you go onto the HEFSI website and find their page on open access, and you look at the page, actually on the right-hand side of the page, there's a link to the Research Council's UK policy on open access, and if you click on that link, it takes you to 404, page not found, which I just think is a beautiful irony, given the complete incompatibility between the open access policies of the funding council and the research funding councils. But anyway, that's another issue altogether. Let's go back and actually examine those three policy statements about why open access is desirable. The first, enable prompt and widespread distribution of research funding. Don't have a problem with that at all. Research findings, don't have a problem with that. And yes, open access could well help in that. But let's turn to the other two. And B, and this of course is one of the main government drivers in this country for requiring universities to go down the route of open access, and that is to create benefits for economic growth. There is a notion that somehow all of these companies and businesses out there are just waiting to get hold of academic knowledge, but they're locked out of the system because of these price barriers. And if we break those doors open, if we let loose all of the content, scholarly content, that suddenly we're going to have an economic revival. That really is the logic underpinning this policy. Now, what worries me is the complete lack of evidence that there is actually any demand from industry and commerce for all this material that we are paying for, and it is us, to be made available by publishers for the world of commerce. And to a certain extent, you can see that with e-theses. As has been said before, I chair and have chaired for the last 4 years, which predates the implementation of open access in this country. I chair the Ethos board here in the UK. Ethos has been making electronic theses available, freely available, to whoever, regardless of whether you're academic or non-academic, for a number of years. We could have told David Willits before he embarked on his policy that the demand of theses, and let's face it, these are often at the very cutting edge of their subject matter, from industry is virtually nil. Go and talk to Sarah afterwards. She knows the downloads almost by heart. And the downloads for e-theses are essentially primarily academics looking at academic work. There is virtually no demand whatsoever from industry and commerce. A little bit, but you can count the theses almost on 2 hands. So what worries me about this policy is that we've gone headline into a policy without any evidence whatsoever, where we've created a product without actually any demand, and paying heavy prices for having generated that product. And of course, even where there is a demand for industry and commerce to access academic journals, realistically, money is not a barrier. You don't walk into any big pharma company and say, oh, you can't afford $500 for a subscription. They'll laugh in your face. It's not a barrier. And even a small and medium-sized industry that wants to access academic knowledge, they know full well all they have to do is slip an academic £500 for consultancy and they can have access to all of the academic literature they like. These walls do not exist in reality. Yet it underpins the key open access policy in this country. So what about policy 3, increased public understanding? Again, in my opinion, this is completely flawed. Yes, I believe that academic work, especially where it's publicly funded, should be made widely available. But there is, in my view, a big difference between public engagement and simply making peer-reviewed specialist academic journals freely available to the public. They are not the same thing. We have had open access around for some time now, but I've yet to see a flurry of letters to the Daily Mail in this country, or let alone the Daily Mirror, saying, thank you very much, Mr. Willits. Thank you very much for your open access policy. I now understand the scientific arguments that underpin climate change, and from this moment on I will stop driving and flying internationally. Okay, I'm over-egging it, but my point is that there is a big difference between communicating with the public in an understandable way and simply feeding them, or trying to feed them, on a diet of academic journals. One is not the same as the other. And in that sense, I actually think that, of course, you could use the monies that have been spent on open access more wisely and invest them in true public engagement. Because the policy of open access and giving them access to serious specialist academic journals is, I think, really not the way to go. And I'll give you one example. Our Vice-Chancellor mentioned this chap called Richard III. You may have heard about him. He died in a battle not far from here, and then got buried under some tarmac in central Leicester. The tarmac wasn't there, by the way, at the time. He actually got buried in the choir of the Church of Greyfriars Priory. We worked together with the Richard III Society to do the investigation. I was privileged, and it was a privilege, to be involved in that. I'm not an archaeologist. I didn't go scraping around the car park with my trowel, but I'm a historian, and I worked on the genealogy side with the geneticists and the DNA specialists in order to identify and verify living day individuals whose DNA we could use as a sample to match against the skeleton. It's essentially a missing persons case. Why am I telling you all of this? Because we have just written up and submitted a learned article that has been submitted to an unnamed top scientific journal, which we hope they will accept very shortly. However, there has been a huge public interest in that Richard III project, possibly more than any academic project of our generation. When we gave the press conference on the project last year, we had 150 members of the press in the audience and 50 television cameras. It was not, well, sorry, it was on the front page of every broadsheet in the world, pretty much. Very few academic projects command that level of public engagement. However, as I said, we have just submitted an article to a leading science journal. I can tell you now, no public member is going to want to read that. It's full of horrible statistics, which they won't understand. It's full of all sorts of things to do with DNA analysis, which they won't understand. So what will we do? We will write a public version of that paper. Open access is not going to solve the problem of public understanding by making that paper available to people. What will solve it is our time and effort writing a different version for a different audience. And that's public engagement. Anyway, lecture over. So in this regard, one could argue that rather RCUK and the higher education sector paying publishers to provide the public with products that they do not want, that money could perhaps be better spent staying within the HE sector, paying academics to provide the public with what they want. But again, perhaps I'm a little old-fashioned, I still believe that all of the departments that we used to call extramural departments and adult learning departments and continuing education departments, which we've all now shut down because we can't afford, do, when we look back, actually have a real value when it comes to public engagement. Anyway, let's move on. What I want to turn to, before I then wind up, is another issue that is particularly relevant to the UK, because in the last 4 months, we have had another announcement, and that is that there will be a requirement as from 2016 that, and here I'm going to use a term called the REF, which anybody from you can tell if people are from the UK higher education sector or not, because normally all you have to do is say REF, and there's this instant glazing over and wobbling of body that people respond to. The REF is the Research Excellence Framework for those who are not in the UK, and is something that happens every 5 or 6 years. It's essentially a census of research outputs, although it's actually only a census of a small proportion of research outputs, because academics have to submit up to a maximum of 4 outputs, which are evaluated alongside other things to do with impact. Anyway, that's a very short lesson on the REF. But what we have been told is that as from 2016, outputs will not be submittable to a future REF unless at the point of acceptance of publication, not at the point of publication, but at the point of acceptance of publication, the material has to be available immediately. The bibliographic details have to be available immediately. They have to be discoverable immediately by anybody in the world. And once embargoes, and there are a series of allowable embargoes within the policy, but once the embargoes have been lifted, the content itself has to be available either from an institutional or subject-based repository. Now, I actually very much welcome this, and this university has embraced this policy, A, by agreeing that we're going to implement it sooner rather than later. We're not going to wait until 2016. We're actually going to implement it next year. And we're also going to extend it where possible, not just to conference papers and articles, but to every type of output, every type of research output. Now, we're doing that, A, to actually show our commitment to the open access cause, and B, to try and wrinkle out actually some of the problems before we formally have to be compliant, but also because I think it will help us to better internally audit research outputs anyway. So I think there are a number of gains to us. But again, I think this policy is not without its problems, costs being one of the key ones. I don't think anybody has really thought out how this is going to be paid for. And the other thing that really concerns me in all of this is that in discussing this policy with HEFSI before they actually announced it, the people there seem to be under the incredibly naive view that somehow universities knew prior to publication what outputs, given that any individual only has to submit 4 of their outputs over a period of about 6 years, which one of those 4 would be submitted to a future ref. And logically, you just don't. There's no way you can predict at the point of publication whether something will be submitted to ref or not. Maybe perhaps a 1 or 2% of all publications, but that's it. You cannot even guarantee that something published in Nature or Science will actually be part of a ref selection for all sorts of reasons that I could explain, having submitted this institution's ref. So what that means is that universities will actually have to make bibliographic records of everything that the university publishes available and make open access pretty much everything that falls within those categories. Not just 4 articles for any one individual, because we can't predict. Now, despite that, again, I very much still welcome this, and I welcome it actually for reasons that probably HEFSI wouldn't predict. Because in my dreams, I think, well, if by 2016 we have an environment where we do have a large corpus of information openly available via open access processes, then we could potentially do away with ref selection and all of the negative things that go alongside it altogether. Because HEFSI could simply harvest these outputs as and when they wanted, and they could make random selections, random audits, etc., of research quality. You almost wouldn't need a ref exercise every 6 years to tell you what the quality of universities' research would be. So you could turn the equation on its head. But as I said, that's very much in my dreams. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to begin to wind up now. I started by saying that I was a very strong advocate of open access, yet you've heard me here go into all sorts of criticisms about the current open access policy in the UK. And that's not because I don't believe in open access, that's because I believe that open access here is the wrong tool for the jobs it's supposedly trying to do. Yes, I believe in public engagement and public understanding of science. Yes, I believe in industry engagement. But open access is not the thing that's going to solve these issues. We need different approaches, different policies. The reason why I believe in open access is actually because nothing to do with public engagement, nothing to do with industry engagement. It's because of the sheer potential for research. And in that sense, what I really want to do is open up and break down the barriers between publications and essentially create a huge set of a huge corpus or set of corpi that can be used for text mining. Because to me, The real reason why you want to make these open and discoverable is about unlocking the content within academia itself. We are the ones who can actually take most advantage of having these things discoverable and mining. The current open access policies, to a certain extent, put the focus, I think, in the wrong direction. And in that sense, let me just end by throwing out a challenge. To me, the real challenge is not actually open access at all. That's only part of the jigsaw, an important part of the jigsaw. But the real kernel, the real nub that we have to solve is not open access of publications or theses per se. It's actually open data and how you actually liberate the underlying data of the publications. We can start with open access. We can start with interoperability of all kinds of metadata. But the real holy grail is how you get both accessible, discoverable, linkable, and usable data. And on that, I will end. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Professor Schurer very much indeed for that very thought-provoking talk. I'm sure by explaining the UK situation, we've made many of the delegates here quite thoughtful about the need to get evidence about who exactly is using the ETDs and why. And I think that could well be a big topic for discussion amongst people later on. If anyone does have questions, I think we just have a minute or two for one or two.
And there's a microphone. I silenced everybody. Oh, there's a hand over here, look.
Thank you very much. In the US, and I also believe in the UK, librarians have been working for actually decades in trying to encourage open access of scholarly output. But really is not a library issue in my view. It's an academic research issue. And it takes leadership from academic administrators like yourself and faculty researchers to make this happen in reality. So how do you help to disseminate your views? How do you convince your colleagues that this is a good thing, or don't you?
Very good question. Let me first of all say straight off that I agree with you that to a certain extent I don't think this is a librarian issue. This is not a technology, realistically, issue. Those technologies are there and they've been there for a number of years. It's more a cultural issue, if I can put it that way. How do I convince my colleagues? Well, of course, what you need is a mixture of carrots and sticks, and preferably some bigger sticks as well. And unfortunately, we actually don't have too many carrots. And of course, the way policy has gone in this country, at least, I know less about other countries, is to provide a series of sticks. It's very much the stick approach, not the carrot approach. I think one of the problems for academics is, how can I put this? We live in a culture where, yes, we want our research or the fruits of our research read as widely as possible, yet equally, to a certain extent, what we really want is not any Tom, Dick and Harry reading our papers or our books or whatever it might be. We actually want what we see as the peer group, however you may define that. Who we really want to read our papers are those people who we think are going to respect our research and help our careers. So, because of that, of course, there's a huge reluctance to place publications, particularly in the STEM subjects, although the same is true for social sciences and humanities as well, but I think it's particularly true of the STEM subjects. You're not going to place your material in certain open access facilities because you fear you will not get the right recognition for doing so. And this is a culture we've created ourselves within the profession, where if you're not publishing in the right journals, then you are not a serious scientist, stroke social scientist, stroke whatever discipline you'd like to add to that. And in particular, and again, the system shoots itself in the foot consistently, when we want promotion to, in your country, tenure, or here, professorship, a chair, senior lectureship, whatever it might be, of course, we value certain output routes over and above others. So at one level, we argue we want open access, but actually do very little to support the logic of it, perpetuating an old system which is based on hierarchy primarily and standing. So we have to pay to keep that old system going when actually we want that system over there. And that's why the financial model doesn't work, because we're trying to actually have our cake and eat it. We're trying to actually keep two systems alive.